Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 8th chapter. Joe was led into a small room with gray walls, where, apart from a table and 2 chairs, there was nothing else. The guard lightly pushed the prisoner in the back and, making sure that he obediently sat down on the chair closest to the exit, closing the door behind him. Gloomy thoughts hovered in Joe's mind. He had been serving his sentence in this prison for 2 whole years, and that was only 1/9 of the entire sentence. During this time, he almost forgot what it was like to be free, breathe fresh air and communicate freely with other people. A crazy thought crept into Joe's head that he was called into this room in order to release him from here early, but common sense suppressed this idea. 18 minutes have passed since the guard walked out the door. Joe, although accustomed to long and tedious sitting in a cell, was already tired of sitting on this hard chair, and he wanted to get up, not to go out, but just to stretch his stiff legs, when suddenly the front door, which was located just behind his chair, opened and the prisoner heard measured steps. The man walked around the table and sat down in the chair opposite Joe. The prisoner began to look at the stranger. He looked like he was about 30-something years old, or at most 40. He had short black hair and a neat mustache under an aquiline nose. He was dressed in a gray and clearly worn-out jacket, under which was a white shirt with a black check, and around his neck was a black tie. The stranger's behavior, or rather the way he confidently carried himself, could be evidence that he had previously served in the military. Joe, bored within the walls of this dull place, only had 2 minutes to understand in general terms who was sitting in front of him. It worked out that the stranger was in no hurry to start a conversation. Automatically he said a dry greeting and, sitting in a chair, simply looked at the prisoner, clearly waiting for something. Finally, he broke the silence in the stuffy air. "So, I have the honor of seeing before me Jordan Thurlow, the same man who, 2 years and 5 months ago, was sentenced in United States District Court for the District of Oregon in the criminal case of one Delia Yonce," he said insinuatingly. When the stranger finished this introduction, Joe felt his insides turn over. It was not a matter of the somewhat rude intonation performed by the interlocutor's baritone, but the fact is that this man, whom Joe sees in front of him for the first time, uttered a name dear to him, even if it was not a secret to everyone who was in this building, but for him, 26-year-old Joe Thurlow. These 2 inmost words caused his body to experience an uncontrollable increase in heart rate and some breathing problems that only went away as the day went on. It was clear as day that the heart wound was fresh even after so much time spent in the dull dungeons of this concrete coffin. The topic that the stranger brought up interested Joe. The momentary confusion caused by the spoken name soon gave way to calm and determination. Joe confirmed that the stranger was not mistaken in his guesses, internally understanding that in fact this man already knew everything if he was assigned a conversation with him. Adjusting his mustache, the Inspector Galbraith, this is how the interlocutor introduced himself to the prisoner, made it clear that now the 2 of them would have a long interlocution. The policeman asked Joe to start a story about how he ended up behind bars, and in particular to focus in the story on everything that concerns Delia Yonce, because this will serve as the basis for the subsequent story, but from his, Galbraith's side. Joe asked why Mr. Inspector decided to start this speaking, but having received a dry response, "Your words, Jordan, will help my investigation," he decided not to waste time and got down to business. So, 2 years ago. Those blessed times for Jordan Thurlow had such a halo in his eyes that it seemed as if a completely different person had lived that life, and that for some reason someone else's memories had entered his head. This state of affairs was not caused by the passage of time. In fact, from the very first day of his prison sentence, Joe deliberately tried to abstract himself from what he had lived before, so that his heart would not suffer from the pain of loss. But no matter how much he wanted to push all the memories away into the attic of his mind, Joe, hearing this dear name from the lips of other people, fell into a state when his heart was ready to jump out of his chest from melancholy. "Delia." He said her name tenderly. It sounds so pretty and sophisticated at the same time. Preparing to lay out the information of interest to the inspector, Mr. Thurlow, as he always did, began to collect his thoughts randomly scattered throughout his mind into a single whole, and also tried to feel as if he was reliving the events of days gone by. If not for this, he would hardly have been able to string together at least 2 words, and so he, having begged Mr. Inspector for a little time, 4 minutes to be exact, began to tune in to catch the wave of the past. Having thrown away the nonsense of high-flown judgments, Joe seemed to freeze in one place, fixing his gaze in front of him. He seemed to begin meditation and surrender his thoughts to the foretime. When Joe finally pulled himself together, the silence in the visiting room was finally broken. His interlocutor, slightly stretching his numb hands, prepared to catch every word that would come out of the mouth of this prisoner. August of that year was unusually hot. Jordan Thurlow noted that this had never happened in his area before. Since his mother's death, he has never traveled outside of his hometown of Portland, and in connection with this, Joe, who previously did not like to travel around the world, roundly took root in the soil of his native home. Most of his free time, which was available to him in his chosen profession of culturologist, then 24-year-old Joe spent walking in the forest behind his residential area. There he slowly, one might even say melancholy, wandered along the paths with his faithful dog and, like romantic poets, his thoughts and feelings were almost completely given over to the nature around him. Exercises of this kind used to drag on until late at night, and so when Joe walked to home with Buffalo, the latter somewhat annoyed the neighbors with his ringing bark, which he made for any reason, be it a mouse running through the bushes or the cry of a night bird sitting on the branches. As a matter of fact, from the sum of all these circumstances it followed that among all the residents of Parkrose neighborhood Jordan Thurlow had a reputation as an unscrupulous and lazy hedonist, whom, as he himself thought at times, was tolerated only because in the modern world you can't just go and tell a person you don't like everything that you think about him, and at the same time give him a strong thrashing, for the letter of the law hovers over every citizen like the sword of Damocles, and therefore everyone, willy-nilly, has to, gritting his teeth, live according to the principles prescribed by the highest of this world. But one fine day, a change that occurred in the life of the entire village seemed to turn the entire routine of the last offspring of the Thurlow upside down. It was from that moment that Joe realized that, formally speaking, he was grabbed by the legs and began to be pulled underground, and even if he really wanted to, all he could do was slightly loosen the grip of the tenacious hands of this strange feeling called affection, but there is no way to stop her intentions for his final fall to the center of the earth. From that sacred, or is it cursed, moment the name Delia was forever imprinted in his mind, and in fact his whole life could be divided into 2 stages, before meeting that girl and after. Jordan Thurlow missed the very moment the Yonce family moved in, because just at that moment he was stuck at work in the center. So before he returns home Joe only caught sight of the burly Mr. Yonce himself, just at the minute when he was paying off the old Harris Sherwind. Joe had previously heard among the merchants that this stocky man with an incredibly scowling expression was planning to move here, but he didn't care much. They then met their gazes, but, without saying a single word to his future neighbor, the gorilla-like Mr. Yonce, wincing somehow in disgust, got into his car, which was parked at the gates of the Harris house and drove away. The next day Joe also left the Parkrose neighborhood. True, not having his own personal car, he boarded the bus in the old-fashioned way, which always traveled on schedule between the countryside and the center. Jordan stayed in the center for about 5 days. There he had a place to spend the night. He rented a room in the cheapest hotel, where, of course, there were not the same amenities as in his home, but what difference did it really make to him where he rested after a working day? Actually, his life always flowed in this way. He was idle in his house, sometimes received calls from his boss, and, going to the center, did essentially meaningless work, which, however, brought in just enough money so that he could live without luxury, of course, but Joe never felt like a poor beggar either. After working those 5 days, Mr. Thurlow left the building where his office was located and, quickening his pace, headed to the bus stop, where he, as always, got the bus that carried people on the route already described above. At that particular moment, the car was a little late, and Joe sat on the bench with a bored look, looking at other people who also needed to get to countryside. They were mostly old ladies who had small retail outlets in the Parkrose neighborhood. Some were with a bag, some were with a basket. 5 minutes passed. Joe looked at his wristwatch. This driver is already a full 15 minutes late. Mr. Thurlow didn't know what circumstance forced old Martin to make such a seemingly minor deviation from the rules prescribed by the Highway Administration, and deep down he had a desire to somehow get even with him. But Joe realized that this was not only a completely pointless undertaking, but also that he, being a frail and stunted young man, could in no way compete with this former athlete, who in his old age decided to choose the profession of an intercity bus driver. Fortunately, when the time on his watch already showed about 6 o'clock in the evening, a familiar white bus appeared around the bend and stopped nearby. Mr. Thurlow was in no hurry to get on, because, being a man, and a young one at that, he was simply obliged to let ahead of the respectable old women who, pushing each other, entered the front door of the bus. When the last woman, whom Joe recognized as the merchant from whom he always bought all sorts of bathroom accessories, disappeared into the black doorway, he got up from his usual place and, under the shouts of old Martin hurrying him, entered the crowded bus interior. Alas, the traitors took all the seats. Even those seats where no one was actually sitting were occupied by heavy bags. Joe had no choice but to spend the entire trip holding onto the handrails, from which the yellow paint had peeled off in places due to frequent friction, revealing the shiny aluminum surface hidden underneath. Behind the large windows of the bus, views of the trees spread out near the highway flashed by, among which there were occasionally lonely buildings, both residential and all sorts of cafes, shops, and similar attributes of the modern American urban landscape. Mr. Thurlow saw all this for the millionth time, so with nothing else to do, he went deep into his thoughts. At such moments his eyes rested on one point and did not register anything. People around him might have thought he was having some kind of seizure, but in fact his mind was simply starting to float somewhere away from his body. During that trip in the bus, the subject of his thoughts was, as you might guess, the fact that a gentleman he did not know was moving to his native village. Joe asked himself what this man outside the city was looking for, what motivated him when, without bargaining, he paid old Harris Sherwind a considerable sum of money for that two-story house where in the old days the drunken brawls of Harris and his friends took place. A theory arose in Mr. Thurlow's thoughts that perhaps this surly guy was a family man, and he bought a house in the outback in order to give his wife and child. For some reason Joe was sure that Mr. Yonce had an inheritor, the opportunity to live in nature. But on the other hand, how could this affect his work? Before Joe's eyes was the sight of Mr. Yonce getting into an unsightly-looking compact car. Apparently, this gentleman made a bet with his family that they would move out of town, knowing that with a personal car he could go to work without any problems. For some reason Mr. Thurlow imagined how this guy who looked like an old bear had to get up early in the morning, in order to have time not only to have breakfast, but also to get to his place of work, which, as Joe was firmly sure of this, was located in a wealthy area of the center. Mr. Thurlow couldn't help and laugh at his vision. The old women sitting on either side of him shuddered in unison. Joe heard the dissatisfied hiss of some tradeswoman, seems to be the one who sold fruit. But to him, tired from this day culturologist, somehow didn't care what these uneducated broody thought about him. He didn't try to restrain this sudden flow of fun that fell on him and laughed until old Martin suddenly turned around and waved his hairy fist right in front of his nose. Non-conflict, and to be honest, cowardly, Joe immediately stopped neighing like a horse, and the driver, muttering rude words to the ill-mannered youth, put his hands on the steering wheel again. 5 minutes later, the bus finally brought the entire mass of people rushing home to their home village, and Mr. Thurlow, who was lucky enough to stand right at the exit, immediately jumped off the bus, raising clouds of dust. The merchant women following him began to loudly swear after him, but he, being in a cheerful mood, which Martin's fist still could not completely extinguish, almost flew to his house. Why was Joe having so much fun? Was it really the image of a gorilla rising early in the morning that his mind painted that caused such a paroxysm of ecstasy in him? Mr. Thurlow did not understand psychology, so he stopped thinking about his own behavior, and, having moved away to a safe distance from the bus stop, he slowed down slightly. Be that as it may, fatigue made itself felt. Approaching his home closer and closer, the mischievous spark of fun inside Joe finally went out, and he, with his head down, seemed to force himself to walk. Having reached the fence of old Harris's house, he suddenly stopped rooted to the spot. At first, Joe himself did not understand why this happened. He continued to stare at his feet, but with his whole body he suddenly felt a strange feeling, as if 100 people were looking at him at the same time. The legs did not obey their owner, and for a couple of seconds Joe could not even move his neck. What kind of misfortune is this, he thought. Time seemed to freeze around Mr. Thurlow, because for him 2 seconds passed as slowly as if 2 millennia. In addition, he felt the heat begin to spread throughout his body, and it seemed that just a little more, and his skin, unable to withstand the high temperature, would begin to melt. But, thank God, this feeling has finally left him. Joe seemed to have woken up from a nightmare. He looked around. The sun has already set and darkness has not yet fallen on the earth. Birds were sitting on a tree on the other side of the road. With their soothing chatter, Joe was able to shake out this strange disease. He had already decided to go to the gate of his house, but something made him glance at the house of old Harris. The lights had not yet been turned on in the rooms, so the windows that looked out onto the road did not stand out against the general background of the house. Not having strong eyesight, Mr. Thurlow was about to turn his head back when he suddenly saw a small human figure in the leftmost window of the second floor. It was a little girl. It was not clear what she was wearing, because from here Mr. Thurlow could only see her head. She had long and tousled black hair with a small bun on top of her head. The young stranger's face had a hint of some subtle cunning. The child looked directly at Joe with curiosity. What attracted her? Maybe it was his confused look? It seemed to Joe that this was precisely the case, for her lips stretched into a smile. How long did they look at each other like that? Mr. Thurlow no longer remembered this. But the piercing gaze of this pair of eyes seemed to drill right through him. He moved awkwardly, still looking out the window. Little girl said something. Mr. Thurlow could not have heard her words from such a distance, and her head disappeared from the square of the window, in which gray curtains now occupied all the space. Joe came close to his gate and, catching in his ear the barking of his faithful dog, who was running on the other side of the fence, with shaking hands he pulled out the key and inserted it into the keyhole. He crossed the threshold of the wicket and, shouting at Buffalo, who was joyfully jumping on his owner, locked it behind him. Putting the keys in his pocket, he squatted down and patted the dog's head. Well, chum, I suffered today. How are you? As if addressing a child, he stammered. Buffalo tried to lick his owner, but Joe got up in time and, wiping his hands on a handkerchief, grabbed an armful of laundry, which he had hung on the clothesline since yesterday, and went into the house. He had thoughts in his head that he, such a bungler, forgot to buy the dog something to eat, but fatigue prevailed over all other feelings, and in the end Joe headed to the bath. There he turned on the tap and, while the bathtub was filling, carefully laid out the dried clothes so that at the end of the washing up they were within easy reach. Then Joe hastily took off all his clothes and, in what the mother gave birth, plopped into his own ocean, which consisted of hot water and soap suds. It seemed to him that all the stress he had experienced that day was draining from his body into the water. While soaking in the bath, he could finally, with a clear conscience, forget about all his worries and become like a carefree seal. Joe continued to lie in the now cold water, until suddenly a trill of a telephone call was heard from the next room. With some laziness, he began to get out of the bath and, putting on clean clothes, wondered who could call him at such a very late time. After getting dressed, Joe pulled on his favorite slippers and went into the bedroom. Before picked up the phone, which was on the nightstand near the door, Joe noticed that he had forgotten to draw the curtains some days ago. Scolding himself for his oversight, Mr. Thurlow raised the phone to his ear. On the other end of the line was Japhet, his close friend and work colleague at the same time. As it turned out, The reason he called was that while leaving work, he accidentally confused the folder with his materials with Joe's folder. The latter, having promised a friend the other day to drop by his house, which was located in the same village, ended the conversation and hung up. It didn't work out very well, thought Mr. Thurlow, staring blankly at the telephone. As he could see, the fruits of his prostration did not bring any benefit, but on the contrary caused inconvenience, not only to Joe himself, but also to the people around him. Heading to the kitchen, he went through the options in his head for what to do with himself, so as not to give his body a reason to relax. He hated sports with every fiber of his soul. About physical labor in the garden he also thought with some anger. Since the death of his mother, this tiny piece of land on his plot has become overgrown with weeds, and, taking the eggs out of the refrigerator, Joe came to the conclusion that no matter how much he wanted, he absolutely could not jump above his stupid head. Lighting the gas, he began to go through the memories of the past day. In the morning, he opened his eyes in that tiny hotel room and, filling his belly with some cheap semi-finished products, went to the office. There he mechanically carried out the actions prescribed by the charter. Joe noticed to himself that he couldn't even really remember what he did at work, after which, having reported to his boss, he headed to the bus stop. Mr. Thurlow skipped in the memories that segment associated with the bus trip, and stopped at how he suddenly felt feverish as he approached the house. So what was it? Could the look of children's eyes really put him, a 24-year-old man, into such a disease? The shape of that little girl's face flashed before his inner vision again. Joe decided to change his train of thought and began to figure out who she could be. 5 days ago he saw Mr. Yonce pay for that house. And now, as you can see, he and his family have already moved in there. Sounds logical, Joe thought. That little girl, as it was not difficult to guess, was the daughter of the new owner of the house. So he was right about his new neighbor having a child. Joe almost felt a sense of misplaced pride in his amazing deductive abilities, but he tensed and suppressed this feeling. Of course, people can't read each other's minds, but Mr. Thurlow had a gut feeling that human thoughts could penetrate the minds of other people like sound waves, and so he tried his best not to think of ideas that, if spoken out loud, would cause at least a couple of dissatisfied glances in his direction. Joe had no idea why, in his own understanding, thoughts were like a transparent glass storefront that anyone passing by could easily look behind, but he had to live with this since childhood. Be that as it may, during that bus ride he managed to hit the nail on the head regarding the marital status of his new neighbor. Joe began to wonder what would change from this day in his life. Well, first of all, now when he goes out into the street, we'll bump into this overweight man either on the road or in the store. Remembering the unkind look Mr. Yonce had given him 5 days ago, Joe made it clear to himself that this family would label him a slacker and vagabond. However, absolutely everyone who knows him thinks so it's nothing special. Mr. Thurlow is no stranger to such attitude from others. He was more concerned about how he would behave in front of his new neighbor's young heiress. Joe still remembered her look. The feeling of being looked at by a crowd of hundreds of people could not be pleasant. Being a rather shy person by nature, the concentration of attention on his person from other people always plunged Joe into some kind of strange numbness, and in this case, not only is it a child, for some reason, Mr. Thurlow was always afraid of kids, thinking that they could read the thoughts of adults, also her location so close to his house. Joe has spent his life avoiding looking other people in the eyes. The human gaze in his understanding is like a strong spotlight that illuminates all the nooks and crannies of his soul. In the case of the daughter of his new neighbor, everything took an even more serious turn. Mr. Thurlow could even swear that quite tangible rays emanated from the eyes of that girl. Trying to find a definition of that evening mystery, he stopped at the spears. His imagination pictured long, transparent poles, as if carved from glass, with sharp tips that came from the child's eyes. What kind of nonsense am I saying? Joe said out loud. I collided with the eyes of an unfamiliar girl and, pardon me, almost died on the spot. I'm completely went limp. Suddenly Mr. Thurlow wanted to kick or just hurt himself. Here the action is not important, it's all about the result. Joe firmly believed that a strong painful shock would bring the desired effect. He looked in front of him. A frying pan, covered with a lid, stood on the stove. Fully aware of his actions, Joe extended his left hand forward and touched the red-hot iron with 2 fingers. After which, he ran to the bathroom, placing his burned hand under a strong stream of cold water from the tap. He smiled. Yes, he taught himself a good lesson. However, the tips of his little and ring fingers were very red and sore. Nothing special. Laying some unfortunate fingers on the altar of socialization is a mere trifle. Mr. Thurlow headed into the bedroom, noticing that it was already quite dark. He turned on the light and began looking in the closet for ointment for burns. Having found the treasured jar, he dipped both fingers into it and, screwing on the lid, put the ointment in its rightful place. For 2, maybe 3 days it will ache a little, but it's okay, he thought. But he realized to himself that there is no need to faint from the fact that all sorts of youngsters are looking at him. Joe laughed at his own joke and went to dinner. Joe finished the scrambled eggs quickly. One might say that he didn't even satisfy his hunger, but, as a doctor he knew once told him, that's not a bad thing, because when go to bed, it's better not to eat enough, because stomach won't be entirely comfortable. Mr. Thurlow did not understand what this could be connected with, but why would he argue with a certified follower of the teachings of Aesculapius? Therefore, having ingested this practically dietary dinner, Joe got up from the table and, having rinsed the plate under running water, put it in the kitchen cabinet and slowly trotted into the bedroom, getting ready for bed. He reassured himself that, in essence, a new neighbor was by no means a disaster. On the contrary, new people and surroundings, it's always good. Yielding to the embrace of Morpheus, before Joe's inner sight a pair of cunning eyes flashed again. He met the next day as a different person. No, Mr. Thurlow's appearance has not undergone any changes at all. He was still a dystrophic man with consumptive breasts, but it was like a switch went off in his brain. Joe seemed to be attacked by euphoria. It seemed as if he was beaming with energy. At breakfast he wondered what to do with himself. Having outlined the plan by which he would act today, Mr. Thurlow finished his meager meal and headed to the bathroom. There, holding his face under a stream of cold water, Joe rinsed off a little and looked in the mirror. His unruly hair was disheveled in all directions, and coupled with his somewhat crazy gaze, he looked like an angry and hungry student. So, he thought, should trim his hair, otherwise with such a hairstyle he will only scare folk. Without thinking twice, Joe went into the office and, grabbing his wallet from the table, put it in his pocket as he walked. Already closing the wicket, Mr. Thurlow remembered that he had not fed Buffalo since yesterday. "It's okay, chum, I'll grab you some food today, I won't forget," he thought. He put the key in his shirt pocket and, slightly straightening his hair, went on a hike to the hairdresser, which was located at the other end of the Parkrose neighborhood. However, Joe did not forget to note to himself that cheerful female screams were heard from the yard of his new neighbors. One voice was older, as he understood, it was Mrs. Yonce, and the second was younger. He already knew the owner of this voice by sight since yesterday. Mr. Thurlow thought that the female half of the Yonce family was enjoying their first day in a new place and, mentally imagining their walk around the yard, continued on his way. It seemed that the thought of those two only made Joe feel better. Without stopping for a second, he began to quietly whistle a melody, which, as it seemed to him, was suggested to him by the singing of birds that he had accidentally heard last night. It was more fun to walk this way, and besides, concentrating on trying to reproduce that song, he finally got rid of obsessive thoughts about his new neighbors. Carried away by this matter, Joe did not notice how he had already approached a residential building, on the ground floor of which there was a hairdressing salon. Having finished with his area, he briefly admired the flowering bushes that grew near the entrance, and, taking a deep breath, entered the room. In the tiny foyer, which preceded the hall itself, his modest person was immediately noticed by Guy sitting on the sofa. It was Kelsey Petipuz, the son of the owner of this hairdressing salon, who, in fact, served as a barber in his mother's establishment. Seeing Joe, he jumped up and he and the client shook hands, after which the latter began to say that, in fact, he needed just remove excess hair on the sides and front so as not to look like some kind of garden scarecrow in public. The hairdresser laughed at these words and got down to business. Mr. Thurlow watched with interest in the mirror as the skilled hands of Kelsey Petipaz brought his hair to a civilized look. It was a real pleasure to see how scissors in the hands of a professional saved Joe from the bristling tangles that so disgusted him and made a bad impression. Despite the fact that he soaked in the bathroom almost every day, he almost never thought about his hair, which is why it, one might say, lived its own life. Joe recalled that in his childhood he did not like to get his hair cut, allegedly because the scissors would accidentally touch the skin on his head. Be that as it may, childhood phobias have finally disappeared from his mind. When Kelsey Petipaz finished his business, Joe, paying him, asked if he remembered the last time he came to him for a haircut. The guy, after thinking a little, somewhat hesitantly stated that up until that moment he had seen Mr. Thurlow a whole year ago. By the way, did anyone get your hair cut today? Unexpectedly for himself, Joe decided to follow up with another question. You are the first client, calm down, said Kelsey Petipaz cheerfully. For at such an early hour few people bother to get a haircut, added the hairdresser. Mr. Thurlow looked at his watch. It was 10 minutes to 9 o'clock in the morning. It turns out he woke up a bit early today. Joe left the hairdresser somewhat gloomy from the thoughts that had washed over him. Did moving his family with a little girl, he thought, really change me so much internally? There was no logic to it, but it happened. He spat angrily to the side, thinking that in this way he expressed contempt for common sense. However, it so happened that the lump of saliva landed not on the asphalt, but on a wooden cart, which was being driven by some old man, who immediately began to angrily express his displeasure to the young man, and Joe had to apologize profusely to him, but even this incident could not drown out the confusion in his head. Soon the old man rolled his cart as if nothing had happened, and Mr. Thurlow, stopping near a building with a bookstore window, wondered what else he should do today. Joe remembered the evening phone call. He should exchange his work materials with his colleague, otherwise this would be an awkward situation. When leaving the house, he forgot to take the folder, so now, without delaying the matter, he ran back. The barber shop and his house were separated by quite a long distance, so Mr. Thurlow, who was not accustomed to physical activity, was exhausted already a third of the way. Alas, you can't jump above your head, he recalled his own thoughts. Therefore, he had to get home at a slow pace, which did not seem like a good idea to him, because he felt that until he gave Japhet his things, these shackles of promise would never fall off from him. After some time, Joe was already in the area where he actually lived. He noted that only now people began to go out into the street, and it was already about 20 minutes to 11, and he suddenly, for no apparent reason, wanted to take a roundabout route in order to approach his house from the other side, without being seen new neighbors. But Joe remembered how yesterday he punished himself for cowardice, and, having overcome this stupid desire, he boldly headed towards the house along the route he had walked a million times. Peering into the faces of passers-by who came across his path, Mr. Thurlow thought that he would certainly meet Mr. Yonce or someone from his family. And so he was not at all surprised when he noticed that near the gate surrounding their site, there were two human figures. From a distance it was clear that one belonged to a portly man, and the second to a little girl. Joe, as he had done at the barber shop, stopped for a moment and breathed more air into his lungs. Well, now he will see with his own eyes the person who last night so greatly changed his inner consciousness. Joe suddenly felt cheerful. He found it funny that he, a grown man, was so impressed by some peanut. It would be nice if some respectable gentleman or lady could give such an impetus to his mind, but the child. When Mr. Thurlow reached the father and daughter, he was already laughing out loud. He caught displeased glance of Mr. Yonce and decided that it was worth stopping not only his laughter, but also his movement. Joe stopped a few steps away from his neighbors, turning over the words of greeting in his mind. For some reason, he couldn't quickly figure out how to greet this family. He seemed embarrassed about something. The three of them stood opposite each other for half a minute, and Mr. Yonce himself was the first to break the silence. Unable to hide his contempt for this inappropriately cheerful young guy, the huge man muttered through his teeth. "What kind of behavior is that? Laugh at the top of your voice. What are you, a horse?" It was a great mystery whether he had such a sense of humor or whether he was trying to tease the impudent young man, but the fact remained a fact. His little daughter, hearing these words, burst into laughter. The father began to hiss at the girl so that she would stop doing this, and Joe was finally able to collect his thoughts. He waited until Mr. Yonce finished scolding his daughter and turned his attention back to his neighbor. When he finally raised his head, Mr. Thurlow immediately blurted out the speech he had prepared. Joe could no longer remember with what words he had greeted them, but the memory of what he had received in return was fresh in his mind. The head of the Yonce family sullenly listened to his greeting and, as if doing a favor, introduced himself to his neighbor as a pharmaceutist. Then he lightly pushed his daughter on the shoulder with the words, "Well, go ahead, tell him what your name is, keep this civil." The girl took a small step towards Joe and, taking the hem of her dress in her hands and, bending slightly, complied with her father's demand. How easy it was to guess. Mr. Thurlow heard only one word from her lips, Delia. Hearing her first word, addressed directly to his modest person, Joe was again for a moment seized by that strange sensation, as if the gaze of hundreds of people were directed at him at the same time. Fortunately, he quickly got over this feeling and, without hesitating in answering, addressed her a compliment, something like "very pretty name." The three of them stood there for a couple more seconds and then went about their business. Mr. Yonce and his daughter headed to the car. Apparently they needed to go to the city, and Joe, still holding in his head image of Delia's crimson cheeks, went to his house to grab a folder with Japhet's materials. It seemed a little strange to him that the girl was embarrassed when she met him in close proximity to her. Mr. Thurlow had cut his hair this morning, so it was unlikely that his appearance had anything to do with it. Maybe this was her reaction to the laughter that had overwhelmed him before? Covering the wicket behind him and at the same time waving away the hungry buffalo, Joe almost ran to his room. He began searching for the folder. For some reason, it slipped his mind where he had put it yesterday. Under the influence of fatigue, after spending about 3 minutes searching, Mr. Thurlow finally found the item he was looking for on the floor near the mirror in the hallway. This is what he screwed up yesterday. He usually always puts things away neatly when he returns home. Picking up a slightly dusty leather folder swollen with papers, Joe suddenly remembered that this happened because before picking up the dried clothes from the street, without thinking twice he threw them over the door to free his hands. The only thing he couldn't understand was why the door was open. Did he, when leaving for work 5 days ago, forget to close the front door of the house itself? Thank God he has a dog to guard his property, otherwise this could have ended badly. Clutching the folder between his legs, Mr. Thurlow closed the door properly. Then he walked up to the gate and, looking at his faithful dog with a knowing glance, stepped over the threshold. Turning the key in the keyhole, with peripheral vision he saw that there was no longer a car near the gate of his new neighbor's house. Clearly, he thought, the pharmaceutist and his daughter were really going to town on business. Joe thought that they had left too late. His logic told him that if Mr. Yonce was going to arrive at his workplace on time, he should have left about the same early as Mr. Thurlow himself that day. After all, in order to get to the center in a small car, needs to spend at least 40 minutes. The bus, led by old Martin, rode for about that long. Putting the key in his shirt pocket, Joe repeated to himself what he needed to do. Now he must fulfill the promise made to Japhet, who last night asked him to drop by to exchange materials. The walk to it was a little less than to the hairdresser, but Mr. Thurlow, knowing his body, discarded the idea of running and, wiping his hands on a handkerchief, slowly directed his steps towards the only area in his village, where once upon a time 10 multi-story buildings were erected. This time Joe no longer whistled to himself after meeting the Yonce family, with the possible exception of Mrs. Yonce herself. He was in such a state of mind when there is no desire to waste energy in vain. When he finally approached the third entrance of house number 154, Mr. Thurlow almost completely lost all his gaiety, and, dialing the apartment number, waited for the door phone signal with a feeling close to the one in which he met Mr. Yonce himself today. So the door opened. He almost ran up to the fourth-floor landing. His friend had already opened the front door, and Joe, without much warmth, said hello to him and entered his apartment, which was filled with the aroma of fresh baked goods. Japhet was somewhat embarrassed by his colleague's gloomy appearance, but, wisely deciding that if a person was not in the mood, then he should not pester him with questions regarding this, he accepted the folder from Mr. Thurlow's hands and invited him to follow him to the kitchen. There he proudly pointed to a dish on which lay a small pile of shortbread cookies. Joe remembered that his friend loved to cook himself, and noticed that he was lucky to be visiting him at the very moment when he had just finished his next culinary experiment. Sitting down in the seat offered by his friend, he watched as Japhet poured boiling water into the teapot. He decided that now it really wouldn't hurt him to eat, considering that he didn't even have any eggs left in his house. Mr. Thurlow finished the last 4 of them this morning. Waiting for the black tea to brew, Japhet did not recognize another because of his principle of being a lover of Indian life. The owner of the apartment shared with his guest the recipe for today's dish. According to him, he simply beat 3 eggs with a mixer. Oh, it's them again, thought Joe, and half a packet of sugar, poured a glass of sunflower oil into this mixture and, having kneaded more flour into it, immediately put the resulting dough in the oven, without even trying to give it any beautiful shape. As Japhet said, this is because it would be a shame to spend time on the beautiful design of a dish that had a high chance of turning into a completely inedible substance after baking. But apparently the gods favored the cook, so his first attempt at making shortbread turned out quite edible. Joe chewed with great appetite the fruit of his friend's culinary labors, not forgetting to wash it down with tea, which, if it had been his choice, he would have replaced with coffee. Looking at the owner of the apartment, Mr. Thurlow noticed that his heart seemed to lighten. Japhet was no longer embarrassed in appearance as he was when he met the guest. Now his face was glowing with happiness. As I understand, Joe noted to himself, like any person interested in the art of cooking, the opinions of other people were always important to him, not like me. Joe didn't notice that the pile of cookies was gradually reduced to a small amount of crumbs. He was still hungry, so he asked Japhet to give him something from the refrigerator. He, pleased with the assessment of his culinary experiment, walked past the guest and, opening the refrigerator, began to list to his friend what he could treat himself to. Of all the above, Mr. Thurlow liked most the can of canned fish, pea salad with sour cream, as well as store-bought sandwiches, which Japhet, returning home from work, grabbed at some eatery located just across the road from the parking lot. Taking the food from his friend's hands and laying it out on the table, Joe read the inscription on the packaging of these sandwiches. Yeah, that means friend Jaff decided to treat himself to some junk food. Apartment's owner, having transferred the dishes chosen by his friend to the table, closed the refrigerator door and did not deny himself the pleasure of joining the meal. So they sat opposite each other, devouring all this culinary splendor by both cheeks. Joe opened the can of tuna with a kitchen knife and both of them, armed with forks, took turns putting oily pieces into their mouths. Mr. Thurlow managed to grab the last piece before Japhet did, and, taking a spoon, began to eat the salad, while the latter opened one of the sandwiches. Tuna and after it pea salad, Joe thought to himself. Yes, this is far from an exemplary change of dishes, but does my friend run a restaurant in his apartment? No. Besides, at the moment he was more concerned not with any rules for serving dishes, and their own calorie content. Therefore, he, without hurrying anywhere, sent this salad into his insatiable mouth, spoon by spoon. The owner of the apartment has already managed to finish the first sandwich, and has already started the second. The third was the last of the food remaining on the table. Mr. Thurlow put the now empty salad plate in the sink and picked up this piece of fast food. On the wrapping paper he saw the marked chicken. Looking at the labels of the sandwiches his friend had gotten, he noticed with some annoyance that, as it turned out, Japhet had taken both beef sandwiches for himself. Oh God, there's that chicken again. First, scrambled eggs at breakfast, then eggs and short crust pastry, and now the meat of this bird itself. What the chicken's curse, he thought to himself, holding a sandwich in both hands. "How's it feel?" asked Japhet, who eating faster than his leisurely friend. Joe, whose jaws were currently chewing a mixture of 2 rolls, a leaf of lettuce and a chicken cutlet, could not give him a word, only nodded in the affirmative. Jaffe's face lit up with happiness again. It seemed that he was glad that the guest liked everything that was in the master's refrigerator, and not just the work of his own hands. "I actually took these sandwiches by accident," he began to tell the guest. "I leave the boss all cheerful, go down to the street and feel like I want something harmful. Remembering that there was a diner next to the highway, I got on my motorcycle and went. I'm driving in general and, noticing a sign, I stop. At the checkout I say I'll have 2 beef and 2 chicken, and, having paid with what I found in my pockets, I continue on my way home. But, having already entered my apartment, I realized that I could not cope with everyone, and I satisfied my hunger with only one. Anyway," he said with some sympathy, stroking Joe. "But he fed you. There's nothing to eat at home, right?" Having already finished with this invention of the hands of cooks unknown to him, Mr. Thurlow replied that yes, Jaff was right, he has serious problems with food at home. Looking around, as if afraid that they were being overheard, Joe was about to tell his friend about his new neighbor, when suddenly Japhet raised his finger up. "Listen, mate, what now writing in papers?" he said loudly. With these words, apartment's owner pulled out the latest issue of the Oregonian from under the table. "Jaff, you know," Joe said hesitantly. Mr. Thurlow wanted to say that he didn't care about all these press, but his friend could no longer be stopped. "Dog earned in bacon," Jaff loudly announced the news headline. "Sounds like the title of a moral story for kids," thought Joe, making himself more comfortable in his chair. In a controversy, 2 dog trainers decided to find out which breed is the most patient and causes more sympathy among others. Friends started reading. "What kind of sinological quarrels?" mumbled Mr. Thurlow. To resolve the issue, they arranged an examination for their pets, Jaff continued. "Do you really thinking what this is interesting to me?" Joe couldn't resist. Japhet lowered the newspaper and looked at him, his hidden behind glasses eyes expressed reproach, like that of a mentor. "Wait a bit, it will be more interesting further," he said and buried his face in the newspaper. "You always tell everyone that more interesting further," Joe imitated his friend. The owner of the apartment ignored this guest's remark and continued reading. "Cummins and I decided to check whose dog performs the commands stay and sit better," tells Noel Saberlow, famous cytologist instructor of Portland, Jaff read. I think I've heard this name before," thought Joe. "We both decided to left our dogs for a whole hour on Pearl District. Well, on a bit of a lark, I placed 2 felt hats next to them and I'm asking for bacon signs too." After these lines, Jaff could not help but laugh a little. "It seems that these are circus performers, not dog handlers," his friend caught his tone. But at the same time he thought that this Noel Saberlow had something in common with that same friend of his late mother who helped her get a dog. Over the years, Joe had forgotten his name, but this extraordinary antics from the newspaper involuntarily made him remember that cheerful, muscular man. "The winner was my Labrador Flary." Passers-by were pleased to encourage the gallant white giant, who also bowed at each donation. Having read this, Japhet raised his head and looked at Mr. Thurlow over his glasses. "Do you think you would have acted the same as the onlookers from Pearl District?" he asked a question. "Well, that's unlikely," Joe replied. "I have my own dog, why should I give money to someone else?" "There is common sense in your words," Jaff nodded. "Only dogless apartment residents can afford such expenses." "How would you do it yourself?" Mr. Thurlow decided to turn the spotlight. Japhet, his hands occupied with the newspaper, furrowed his brow. "You yourself live in an apartment and don't have a dog," his friend rightly reminded him. The owner of the apartment decided to evade this question and returned to the newspaper. In an hour Saberlow's dog Flary earned whole $8 United States, and his competitor, Cummins' fearsome Rottweiler named Raider, just a measly $2 American bucks, he read. "I hate Rottweilers, Jaff." "I hate 'em," theatrically exclaimed Joe, imitating a hero from some action movie. You're not the only one in Portland, it's now scientifically proven, Jaff laughed. Was that the end of the article? Mr. Thurlow said, seeing his friend put the newspaper on the table. Yes, that's the whole note. Or do you think that an article about some trainer would deserve a separate page? It's understandable, his listener nodded. The best thing about it is the eye-catching title. And if remove it, his friend answered, then there would be nothing interesting left. So why did you read it to me then? Joe looked at Jaff somewhat reproachfully. He didn't answer, he just took off his glasses and began to wipe them with a piece of suede. Joe reached for the newspaper. You can take her with you, apartment's owner said casually as his friend picked up a copy of the Oregonian. No, I'll just take a look, his guest answered hastily, running his eyes over the lines. The first thing that caught his eye was the huge heading, under which was indicated the name of note's author, certain Megan Heaton. Next was the text that Jaff had just retold to him, and at the very end of the article there was a black and white photograph in which the big man was holding a huge white Labrador on a leash. The caption under the photo read Noel Saberlow and his faithful Flary. Joe looked at it and froze, not believing his eyes. This is the same trainer who helped our family with dogs, he exclaimed, throwing the newspaper back on the table. Jaff, who had already pushed his glasses up his nose, raised his eyebrows in surprise. What, do you feel proud that your friends are mentioned in the press? He quipped. Mr. Thurlow said nothing to this, only lowering his head down onto the linoleum that covered the kitchen floor. Curious, Jaff continued, how much would your Belgian Malinois earn? He meant buffalo. I don't think anyone would give him even a cent, Joe noted with some sadness. He's so rude. This same Saberlow fitted it for you, right? His friend smiled. Yes, of course, Mr. Thurlow remarked with some annoyance. Everyone is always fooling you, the owner of the apartment said, either comforting or mocking. And then they write about those who fooled you in the newspapers. Stop it, his guest was not amused. Meanwhile, Jaffet suddenly pretended that there was no conversation between them about dogs, and asked his friend with sudden gaiety in his voice. Well, you must have been very surprised when you opened the folder yesterday and saw materials about Greece there? Yesterday I was quite surprised when, instead of materials regarding Kynthia, I found in my folder sheets covered in someone else's handwriting, telling about some book bestsellers in Munich in the 70s. Yes, it was true, Mr. Thurlow was tasked by his boss to collect information of this kind. The task was essentially to collect information on the sales of several famous fantasy novels in the above-mentioned city. In this matter, Joe was greatly helped by one man who was called Onkel Korbel behind his back. He was an old German from Wiesbaden, who in the early 80s moved from there to America, or rather to Portland, according to him, because of the contraband trade. On the Das Gelobte land he did not stop his dirty deeds, on the contrary, he organized a bookstore, where, illegally, of course, he sold German books at half price to people who could read in this language. Among them, as you might guess, was Mr. Thurlow himself, who more or less learned German as a child through the school curriculum. One might even say, he was one of the few among his peers who really became proficient in studying it. As a matter of fact, with the support of Onkel Korbel, Joe began to write his little investigation. To be brief, for some strange reason among the Munich residents enjoyed wide popularity book by certain Die Brüder Strugatsky, whose long title could be roughly translated into English as It's Not an Easy, to Being a God. Mr. Thurlow had no idea what the book was about, but the impressive figure that appeared in the column Am Bessen Verkaufen, bestsellers list, interested him in the sense that if the Germans bought this book in great demand, then why shouldn't lazy American Joe read it at least once? On the advice of old German, Joe, without using the services of a translator, under his dictation, wrote something like an application, where he indicated the title of the book and the author, and gave it to Korbel, who stated that thanks to this procedure, the desired book will be on Mr. Thurlow's desk in a couple of weeks. By the way, the old jackal didn't even take a cent from him for this operation. Apparently, friendly relations among the German people have some kind of almost sacred value, although, looking at Onkel Korbel, Joe strongly doubted it. Putting aside thoughts of the proud German people, Joe answered the question addressed to him regarding the folder. No, Jaff, to be honest, I was so tired yesterday during the bus ride that I was too lazy to look at the materials. I immediately went to wash. And you distracted me from the bath with your call. He couldn't resist inserting a barb into his sentence, which in good faith should have been said yesterday on the phone, but then he was a little in the wrong mood. Well, I'm sorry, Joe, I didn't know that you were simmering in boiling water like a chicken in a saucepan. Jaff was also not averse to exchanging jokes with his friend. Oh, how I'm already sick of this chicken topic, Mr. Thurlow shouted in anger. The owner of the apartment asked his guest what was the matter, and Joe briefly told him his previously mentioned thoughts regarding the fact that since yesterday evening he had not really eaten anything other than eggs. Jaff had joked that today, at least, he treated him to peas and fish, but his interlocutor, having expressed his experiences, closed himself off and did not really hear his words. Jaff, noticing his friend's condition, hinted to him that it might be time for him to go home. Shuddering slightly, Mr. Thurlow agreed with him and, shaking Jaffa's hand, wanted to say something, but his tongue no longer obeyed him. Leaving his apartment on the fourth-floor stairwell, Joe shivered a little. It turns out that he could not even imagine that because of the cooking it was so hot in Japhet's apartment that, having gotten used to such a temperature, he was already frankly cold outside its walls. Barely moving his feet, Mr. Thurlow went downstairs and, almost colliding at the door with some neat man with wide eyes, out of fear or what, finally left this building. Outside, he felt that the weather had changed somewhat. And in fact, the sun, previously shining brightly in the sky, was covered with clouds for the first time this week. Now, Joe thought, he wouldn't have to squint in the blinding sunlight as he approached his house. This essentially simple circumstance for some reason filled him with energy, and he ran forward, as he had in the morning. To his own surprise, Mr. Thurlow was not exactly exhausted. His legs were not even tired by the time he had covered the entire path and, pulling the gate key out of his pocket, looked at the roof of the har. Sorry, Yonce family. His sensitive ears caught the sound of walking on the grass, which was coming from behind the neighbor's fence. Someone from the female half, for Mr. Yonce himself could hardly move so easily, was walking near the house. Joe, after a slight hesitation, opened the gate door and almost lost his balance. His starving dog pressed paws against his stomach with such force that if his owner had not grabbed the iron gate with left hand, he would inevitably have been lying on the grass right now. It seems that during this incident some funny sound came from Joe's mouth, apparently a muffled cry, for on the other side of the fence, from the side of the new neighbor's house, a well-known ringing laughter, like the sound of bells, was heard. Mr. Thurlow suddenly felt a surge of shame. He was almost completely sure that the little girl could not see anything behind the tightly packed boards of the wooden fence, but he understood that the very noise of the fuss, as well as his scream, although he couldn't remember whether he actually made it at that moment, caught her attention. Hesitantly struggling with himself, he was able to control his feeling of embarrassment and, as if nothing had happened, said to his faithful buffalo, "Well, excuse me, chum, I completely forgot that you've been hungry for 6 whole days." After patting the dog behind the ear, he went into his home. Pulling the formal shoes off your feet, he could not get used to the fact that wearing sandals is not a sign of falling into childhood, he said out loud so as not to forget. "Okay, Joe, remember, you must feed the dog, otherwise you will pay dearly for not looking after Protector." The somewhat commanding tone of his own address slightly stretched the corners of his lips, but inside he was not laughing. For now, he wants to take a short nap. He was decidedly too lazy to go to the bedroom, so Joe settled down right on the sofa, which stood in a fairly spacious kitchen next to the dining table and, putting a seemingly tightly packed sack of flour under his head, stretched out his legs and, forgetting about everything in the world, surrendered to the power of the younger brother of death. The dream he had then on the kitchen sofa struck him with its strange combination of cute and creepy in equal proportions. In more or less detail he saw the coast of some sea. On sand strewn with shells of Vieira, a scallop, 2 children were running around, a boy and a girl, both of them looked about 10 years old each. The children were dressed in some old fashion, evoking an association with Victorian England. They ran after each other across the sand, unwittingly scattering it with their feet. Then they stopped next to each other, and the boy, taking out a black bowler from somewhere in his bosom, Joe remembered that it was clearly sized for someone older than that child, threw it up. The hat spun in the air and fell into an air current, which carried it away from the water. The boy rushed to catch up with the headdress. The girl remained standing in place, looking after him and shouting something. Apparently, these were encouraging words. Soon the figure of her friend disappeared behind the sand dunes that stretched deep into the beach. The little girl apparently got tired of standing in one place, and she skipped along the tracks left by her friend's bare feet. And then, in fact, Mr. Thurlow saw what plunged him into horror then, as soon as the girl came quite close to the dunes, when suddenly 4 creepy people jumped out of there. They were dressed in black suits, black cloaks fluttered behind them like raven wings, and all of them, except one, the fattest one, had black bowlers on their heads shiny with sweat. These men in black were running at a slow pace, as if the world itself had stopped at that second, and as they walked, they pulled black rubber-covered police batons from their belts. The last thing Joe remembered was the heart-rending scream of the girl from whose eyes he saw this action. What a nightmare! Having woken up and, trying to calm down his wildly beating heart, he blurted out throughout the kitchen. Sitting on the sofa, he suddenly felt that his cheeks and hair were covered with something like dust. He quickly rose to his feet and saw dense clouds of white powder rise in the air. Joe swore angrily. It turns out that while he was sleeping, the sack of flour opened up and now he will have to put himself in order again. Well, okay, he, who likes to lie in the bathroom longer, is no stranger to washing, but here's what to do with the flour scattered on the sofa and on the floor. Cleaning had never been a priority for Mr. Thurlow's household chores, so when he thought that sooner or later he would have to collect the spilled flour into a garbage bag with a broom and dustpan, he suddenly felt uneasy. He glanced at his left hand. The wristwatch, the glass of which was lightly coated with flour, showed 20 minutes to 6. Must hurry, suddenly it dawned on Joe. The butcher's shop closed at 6:30, therefore, he needed to leave the house as soon as possible so that his dog would not die of hunger. Mr. Thurlow walked into the bathroom and glanced at his reflection in the mirror. Flour covered his hair just this morning. Joe decided not to resort to water, because if he went outside now with a wet head, then come to me, common cold. Therefore, he solved the problem of unpresentable appearance in this way. He took off his flour-stained jacket, shirt and pants, and put on a t-shirt and shorts instead. For a long time he had not taken both of these items of clothing out of his wardrobe due to his strange complexes. After that, Joe stood over the trash can and, using a comb, began to comb out the flour stuck in his hair as thoroughly as possible. After looking in the mirror, he decided that some kind of headdress would come in very handy for his wardrobe, because he couldn't get rid of the flour dry, and he didn't want to scare people with his white hair. Barely audibly swearing at his own sloppiness, he opened the wardrobe again. There he found an old camouflage cap, clearly designed for a much younger person. But, lacking anything else, Mr. Thurlow put it on his flour-dusted head and once again looked at his reflection.